Can you just re-explain to me like what you do? I understand that you work with deployments and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I work with a cybersecurity company that builds out FedRAMP environments for companies that want to sell their software solution to the government. We also do like non-FedRAMP stuff and just provide like secure infrastructure for just normal companies that might be a little bit more security minded, but primarily we work with like FedRAMP environments.
Okay. Yeah. So you do a lot of, you were telling me you do like a lot of stuff with within the cloud and things like that, right? That's mainly where you're focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. And Azure, AWS, and GCP. So we try to get all three. So
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So since you went through the web app pen testing course, the first thing that there's a few things I'm going to share with you during this call that I think would be really good stuff to look into for you specifically, because obviously your situation is a little bit different than a lot of the people that took the course, and a lot of people that were in there were trying to move it into cybersecurity, like from wherever they were at. But yeah, I'm glad that you were still able to get a lot of value from the course, even using it as a way to learn more about cybersecurity to make you better at your current role. But yeah, now that you went through the web app pen testing side, there's a lot of stuff that kind of translates over into cloud security. Obviously with the cloud, right? A lot of those applications that you're deploying are web applications. So for one thing, all those vulnerabilities that we covered in the course would apply to those apps as well. So that's where there's some crossover, just like immediate crossover. But when you're talking about, specifically when we're talking about like cloud security, I know we didn't really cover any of that in the course, but I think now would be like a really good time to cover some of this stuff. But a lot of times we're looking at the security like in the context of like microservices, containers, and basically how they're deployed into the pipeline and stuff like that. So with that being said, like there's certain classes of vulnerabilities that you see very common. Like a lot of them have to do with misconfigurations and stuff like that. And yeah, that's probably something that you're a bit familiar with, like, the different configurations of things. And a lot of the things, like if you're talking about the most low hanging fruit, like the easiest to find vulnerabilities that a lot of attackers have found within like cloud environments, it's especially like unsecured buckets and containers and stuff like that they should be locked down, but they're not, or like there's like some kind of permissions that they change from the default and they forgot to change it back, or whatever the case may be. But I know like there's been a lot of data leaks out there when companies went to the cloud and they didn't secure something. So a lot of it does come from like the configurations of things. And then specifically with, some of the technologies, cloud technologies you mentioned there, like AWS and Azure, those have like, and I mean, obviously, like those have different ways they implement stuff and different, they're a lot, they do the same thing, but the way they do them are a lot different. So there's a lot of security implications that are specific to like AWS or specific to Azure as well. So like the more that you work with those technologies, you'll be more familiar with those. I will say like, just to get it out there that I am not like a cloud expert or anything like that. But I do work with some people that have taken cloud certification, specialize in that stuff. And that is one thing that I understand is that a lot of the vulnerabilities as well, there's ones that are really specific to the cloud technology that you're working with for sure. But yeah, another vulnerability class that we talked about in the course was authentication related vulnerabilities. And so usually like when you look at that, and let me just share my screen for you, it'd be a little bit easier here. I'll just pull up like the OWASP top 10 and we can kind of see how a lot of that stuff translates into the cloud stuff.
Cool.
Yeah. So this is like the OWASP top 10 that I know I cover this a little bit. Like we kind of used it for an overview in the course, but
Yeah.
yeah, with specifically, yeah, so specifically with the like the authentication related stuff, the way that usually like when we're talking about web apps, we're talking about authentication issues within like the HTTP protocol or whatever. But usually for like cloud, it's more of like the roles and the scope and privilege escalation opportunities that you can do within like, you know, to go from one level of access on say like within AWS to like a higher level of access.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's basically like what we call like a privilege escalation vulnerability. Now within the context of the course that we just took, right, a lot of the times I did mention privilege escalation, but it was more in the sense of like I would go from a user account on this web app to an admin on the web app. Whereas, you know, obviously with cloud, it's kind of within like AWS and stuff like that. And what's really cool is there are some like hacker challenges. I know that you are more technical, so I'll see if I can find like some of the boxes, but I know there's some CTF, some capture the flag challenges that I've seen people do. I haven't done any of these myself, but I've seen them where someone will get a reverse, they'll get remote code execution on a system, kind of like we were showing in the course. I showed you guys a little bit. Yeah. There's ones where like you'll get like you'll get access to like a cloud environment, and you'll have like, you know, you'll try to pivot from like the AWS account to like fully compromising the server. So some of those might be really interesting. You could try out. I've seen some people do like walkthroughs on those, and they're like running a bunch of like AWS commands. I'm not really too well versed in the cloud stuff, so I don't know like I would have to look up a lot to do that. But yeah, that's kind of interesting.
That would be cool to do.
Well, yeah, I'll see if I can find some stuff for you and send it to you after this. But yeah, we did, you know, another thing we covered was like the insecure deserialization. I know we covered that towards the end. That was one of the more advanced attacks. And that's like a application level attack, because basically, you know, that was a pretty code heavy section, if you recall, because and you know, if you need to review any of these, that's fine too. But basically, just to refresh your memory, with the insecure deserialization, we were basically injecting into like the programming language, like we're injecting our own object that when it gets deserialized, it will run our code or whatever. So we're conducting that attack very much at the application level. What you find more with cloud security is there's a lot more of like infrastructure attacks and stuff like that. So one, you know, a lot of them relate to like proxies, stuff like that, and also SSRF. I know I very, very briefly touched on SSRF in the course. I didn't dedicate a full webinar to it. Is that one that you recall, or do I need to jog your memory on that a little bit?
Yeah, jog my memory on that one.
Yeah, it's all good. Yeah. So, I mean, here, let me just pull up, while I'm at it, I can just pull up the Portswigger thing on that. But yeah, this is actually one of the most common vulnerabilities that you see within cloud environments. That's why I bring this one up. So I would say that like once you go through the course, once you review the stuff in the course, this would probably be a pretty good one to look into just for what you do on your day-to-day. So yeah, SSRF is server-side request forgery. So yeah, this is, let me zoom in a bit here. This is basically like the diagram. So if you have like, say you have like some external facing website, and then you have a bunch of internal servers. This is typically what you'll see with like public sites out there on the internet and stuff like that, or even things that are connected across different, you know, subnets and things like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, this website, right, it might have to interact with internal, you know, tech stacks from like, you know, other internal servers. So maybe it relies on some internal API that's located on another physical server, you know, their IP address, right, or something like that. Yeah. I mean, in the cloud environment, it could be like, you know, there might be some backend services related to like AWS or Azure that your website needs to interact with. So basically, if the vulnerability has a server-side request forgery vulnerability in it somewhere, then what it would allow attacker to do is send that request on behalf of the web server to interact with these internal systems. And in the worst case, an attacker could actually use that to gain access to other internal systems that they shouldn't have access to. And the reason that that works is that from the perspective of all these like internal servers here, it looks like the request is just coming from the server, right? Because typically, you know, you'll have all your internal stuff firewalled off from the outside. So an attacker couldn't like just directly start interacting with these internal systems. But because they're exploiting a vulnerability in this web server that has to be able to communicate with these servers, then they can make the traffic look like it's legitimate traffic coming from that web server and just basically use it as like a proxy basically to conduct further attacks. Yeah.
That makes sense. That would explain why we use like a lot of internal firewalls for for a lot of our other tools.
Yeah, it's like a defense in depth strategy probably. But yeah, a lot of this is like, you know, it's kind of exploiting the fact that like obviously this web server has to have, you know, it has to have firewall rules and stuff that allow it to communicate with the internal systems. Otherwise it couldn't make like the API calls or database calls or whatever it needs to do.
Right.
So yeah, that's where like some of that stuff can be opened up for attack. And you know, like here, the example that they give here for this one is like a post request that makes an API call here to this internal API. And, you know, if the developers of the application are not properly validating this API call, because obviously in a lot of cases, you'll know like, okay, it should, you know, only make calls to like these servers here that, you know, that are our internal servers, right? It shouldn't make calls to like itself, you know, the local host, right? Yeah. So that's something that like the developers could add to validate that. Like you could use like what's called like a whitelist validation of like only allow the known URLs here, the URLs that we expect to be called. That's like a whitelist example, or a blacklist could be like block certain things like block localhost. Typically, if you can do the whitelist validation, that's always better, because with blacklist, you're kind of playing a game of cat and mouse of like, because even with this here, say you blacklisted localhost, well, they could put the IP address 127.0.0.1. You blacklist that. Well, there's like a whole like, you know, I showed this a lot in the course, but there's a, you know, the payloads, all the things. If we, I mean, even if we go to this on SSRF or the server side request forgery, we can immediately see like so many different bypasses that'll work against that. Like say they try to block like a local host, like I said, you can sometimes you can put it the IP address in as a decimal value. You can use octal format. You can do like all kinds of different ways of, and that's where like the hacking and pen testing stuff is like, it gets really creative. Like the attackers do some really creative stuff to bypass this stuff. It's actually pretty interesting to have a look through some of these different bypasses just to see like how crafty some of these really are. But yeah, there's all kinds of different bypass techniques. That's why like generally by like using blacklisting by itself is something that is not a very good idea. If you have to use, I mean, there's obviously some use cases where they cannot do the whitelist validation. In that case, you want to have like a layered security model. You want to have some other mitigating factors in place just to protect yourself in that scenario. But yeah, here, obviously there's like no validation being done and you're able to enter in whatever. So if the attacker changes the stock API value to localhost/admin, you're able to access the admin page, because the assumption here is that like, you know, if we try to just go to this directly, like on the site, like we try to just browse to /admin, it would say that, you know, it would look at our IP address and say like, oh, you're not the local host. And because we're not the local host, it would deny us. Right. But in this, you know, scenario here, this niche scenario, you know, the local host does have access to admin, so you're able to get in. But similarly, right? Maybe you don't go after local hosts. Maybe you start just trying a bunch of different local IP addresses, and you basically do a scan of the entire subnet, and you find out like what servers are active, right? If I just started, say you know, obviously you're probably familiar with some networking, right? If I look for local IP, you know, if I knew the local IP address ranges, like, right, there's like the 192 range, there's like the 10 dot range as well. Yeah. If I just like got a word list, I just created a word list of like all the IP address, or I just wrote a short script to build out a list of all the possible IP addresses of like a local subnet. I could just feed that into something like, you know, the burp intruder. I could just automate that and have it just send out all those requests, and I'll see which ones come back with like a different response code, like a 200 OK, for example. And then I know like, okay, so this IP address exists. This is a local server here. And then I could start looking, I could grab a word list of different endpoints and see like, okay, like what can I access on that? And that's just kind of the process you would go through from the attacker side. But yeah, certainly a lot of these attacks exist within like cloud infrastructure and stuff like that. So definitely a good one to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting seeing it from the attacker's perspective, because we're, you know, doing the best we can to prevent, you know, somebody from doing this. So it's good to see the other side of the coin for sure.
Yeah. And another one that's really relevant to cloud is this one is like a little bit more advanced. I didn't cover it in the course, but yeah, this one is really popular. Actually, HTTP desync attacks, which is basically it kind of expands on the request smuggling. So what I would say is like start with the HTTP request smuggling here. So this one is basically, this one is like really interesting. You're able to, it kind of exploits how certain reverse proxies are working. And they have like the whole, you know, infographic and detailed explanation here. But basically what you're doing is you're inserting your own separate HTTP request inside of another HTTP request. So yeah, you see here, like there's this post request here. And if it's using like a certain kind of encoding that it's using to denote where that request ends, you can basically make it think that the request ended and then start your new request and make a, like, you know, a get request to admin or something like that, and use that to like bypass stuff. But yeah, let's see here. This is one that I had learned a while back. I need to refresh my memory on this a little bit as well, actually. But this is like the general idea here. And it depends on like basically a lot, like the, you know, how, like if it uses this the chunked, like the transfer encoding here. But yeah, this is definitely a good one to look into as like a starting point, because then I know like this attack here, the desync one, kind of expands on that. And there's also like this this DEF CON talk. Some of these talks are like really cool too. You can see all this stuff and like how it actually comes into play, like with some actual examples, things like that. But
yeah, definitely, you're gonna send me down a rabbit hole.
yeah, the desync stuff is like, yeah, I haven't looked into this one as much yet. So but yeah, I would say that this is one thing that I've heard quite a bit of buzz around as far as like in the cloud space. So it's definitely something that I'd look into. And another thing I wanted to share with you as well is I know that like you use Docker and stuff a lot, right? Containers.
Usually, yeah, we'll usually use them inside of like EKS or something like that.
Yeah. One thing that's pretty interesting video started playing on my channel or on my other monitor. But yeah, another thing that's like really interesting, will probably be interesting for you to look into, is some of the, you know, the privilege escalation they can do to break out of like Docker containers and stuff like that, right? Because I think I mentioned a little bit in the course, you know, with the privilege escalation of like say with within the context of like remote code execution, right? So like if you are able to run code on a server, you know, whatever you exploited to be able to execute that code, you'll be running as that user. So for example, if there's a web server and it has a remote code execution vulnerability, say there's like a Apache web server, right? And you're just running that as like the www data user. That's usually the user, like the service account that runs like a Apache server, right? If I exploit that web server and get code execution, I'll have a Linux shell as the www data user. So from there, I would need to, if I wanted to fully compromise the server and become root, then I would need to do some privilege escalation on the actual Linux server in order to do that. Well, obviously, if you're running you know, if you have a container, like a Docker container, and inside that container, you're running like a web application or something like that, and they exploit the web application, then you're still going to be a little bit protected in the sense that they're going to be inside the Docker container. So they're not going to immediately have access to like the rest of the server that container is running on. But there are a lot of different Docker breakout techniques you can use to try and break out of that container and gain access to the server, the overall, you know, the server that it's running on. So this might be kind of interesting stuff for you. Like a lot of the stuff is like pretty technical here, but it should be up your alley, I would think. But yeah, there's all kinds of different techniques to do it. And personally, I've done some capture the flags and stuff like that, where it's like I got code execution, and then I realized that, oh, I'm like within a Docker container, and I've used some of these techniques personally to break out and to fully compromise the system. So yeah, there's tons of different ways to do it. And it also kind of open up your eyes to some common misconfigurations that might lead to privilege escalation, like within Docker and stuff like that. Cause that's basically what this is exploiting, just misconfigurations. And yeah, that's something you're going to notice a lot with like cloud and containers and stuff is, yeah, I mean, usually, unless you're running like a super outdated version that has like an exploit for it, usually the way that an attacker will get in is through some kind of misconfiguration with this stuff. That's usually how they'll exploit it.
Yeah, definitely. I see that happen more often than
yeah
than it should, but
yeah. And I mean, you probably know this, but I know that like a lot of people that are new to security, this is one thing that a lot of people ask. So I'll just cover it here, is that when it comes to like different software versions, like, you know, some software is might have like, you know, critical vulnerabilities on it, whereas like the next version of that software doesn't have the critical vulnerability. And some people are like confused about that. So usually, you know, the way it works obviously is that they patch the vulnerability or whatever. And I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory, right? Like they patch the vulnerability in the next version, and then that vulnerability is no longer there. But what trips people up a lot of times is that sometimes you might not have a vulnerability in a particular version, and then a new version comes out, and then there's like a vulnerability for that version that wasn't in the older version. And the reason for that is, you know, all the time, the developers are adding new features, new functionality to the applications, to the technology, right? So anytime you add like a feature, you also got to think about the security implications of what that opens up. You know, you like to have like all the features and stuff like that, but then that's a bigger attack surface, right? So especially like, you know, say you add some kind of file, you know, you have a basic static website, right? That's like the most secure website you could pretty much have, but it also doesn't have like hardly any functionality, right? But then say you add like some file upload functionality to it, that suddenly like greatly expands the attack surface and the risk there as well. It doesn't necessarily mean it's vulnerable, but, you know, obviously there's a greater chance now at that point. Just like they say like all the time, like the kind of joke that isn't really a joke. They're like, well, yeah, if you want to secure your computer, just like don't you know, turn out, like unplug it from the internet, like you know, power it down. Like yeah, it's like pretty true. It's like, yeah, the more features and functionality you have, it's like the expanding the attack surface basically.
Yeah, it's like the more convenience you have, the less secure it is most of the time.
Yeah, most of the time, yeah. Oh yeah, another really cool privilege escalation vulnerability is so you're pretty familiar with Linux then, I'm sure, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, another really cool one. You might want to try this sometime if you have like a Linux VM or something like that. Um is that if your user is a part of any kind of containerization group, so if your user is a member of the Docker group or LXD group, you can pretty much always use that to privilege escalate to the root account. Let's see if I can find a quick article on that to show you. And the reason for that is that like these containerization groups, they require special privileges in order just to work. And usually like, especially if you just spin up like a Docker, like if you basically, a lot of times, like when you first install a lot of this stuff, like your user account will automatically inherit these group, like you'll be a part of these groups. And yeah, if so, you can actually just privilege escalate. And so, yeah, you might want to like try this out. You could do this with Docker as well. But basically you can install like a super tiny version of Linux, like Alpine Linux, something that's meant to be like super small. And you can use that. Like here, they're like building an Alpine image and using the flag security privilege equals true. And that way you're going to force it to interact as root with the host file system. And you're able to do this because you're part of the LXD group in this case. And then, yeah, you just run the commands to start up the container basically. And then from there, you can just mount the file system and break out of it from there.
Oh, damn.
yeah. So it's pretty cool, actually, pretty interesting. You could do like something really similar with Docker as well, I'm pretty sure.
That's awesome. I'm gonna have to try some of this stuff out just for my own knowledge. Like,
yeah. I mean, it'll be like it'll be a worthwhile exercise, I think, too. It'll get you thinking more in the security mindset, because, like you said, you have a lot of the technical skills on the actual deployment side of things and all that, and the CI/CD and all that kind of stuff. I think this would be like a good way to, especially now that like the company you work for is doing a lot of cybersecurity related stuff, just kind of bridging that knowledge gap.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a big push for me to like seek out this information, because it's not like all in one convenient place. And it's kind of like a daunting task to be like,
yeah. No, yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, there is obviously with like everything in existence, right? You can find it somewhere on the internet, but it's like, it can be really time consuming and cumbersome to like try to seek it all out on your own. So definitely one of the reasons why I want to put the course together. And I think in the future, covering some other major domains within pen testing as well would be like really valuable. But yeah, did you have any questions for me on anything?
Probably just like when do you plan on having like a networking version of the application side, I guess, because I'll probably get involved in that. That's a little bit more like directly related as well.
Wow, yeah, that was actually like the perfect question because yeah, obviously the next course that I'm doing is with Josh. We're teaming up. We're making well, I told you all about it before. We're basically teaming up on a course. But the next course that I'm going to do is actually going to be, after that, is going to be network pen testing. I'll let you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll jump on for that one too. Also maybe like, well, you have some like Active Directory videos too, huh? Because we use Active Directory quite a lot.
Okay, yeah.
And I think people look at that as like, oh, it's basically like not necessarily unhackable, but it's like super secure.
That's hilarious. It is so easy really to exploit Active Directory. You know what I mean? It is like laughably easy to exploit, because a lot of the times, like for Active Directory, the actual exploitation part, you're not even exploiting vulnerabilities. You're just exploiting like the way that it works. That's the crazy part. So it's like with Active Directory, And that's why you probably hear a lot in like the corporate world of people saying like you have to have a secure password, because like that is actually true for Active Directory. If you don't have a secure password, you're pretty much toast, because there's like there's like so many ways that you can basically just abuse the way that Active Directory works to get to get the user's ticket when like you shouldn't be able to get their ticket, but you just can, because like that's just how Kerberos works. And once you get the ticket, like you're not guaranteed to exploit it if you have their ticket, but if you can crack that offline, so if you can password crack their ticket because they have a weak password, then you can just gain their credentials, and then obviously from that point you can do whatever they can do. And also another reason that it makes it really easy to exploit stuff and gain access to people's accounts on Active Directory is because a lot of the like the way that NTLM works is past, you know, like with the pass the hash. A lot of times, as long as you can get their hash, you don't even need their password, because you could just pass the hash to authenticate as them to different services and things like that. So that stuff's like super interesting. I'm definitely going to make a course on that at a certain point. That might actually be the last one I do this year, but I haven't completely confirmed that yet.
That would be awesome. It would give me an excuse to be like, hey, we need to stop using Active Directory because it's awful.
Oh yeah, well that's the thing, is there's not really like a good alternative. That's literally like 99% of companies use Active Directory in their internal network, because so far there just hasn't been a better solution for like managing, like at scale, I should say, managing all the permissions and stuff like that. But really, I mean, you can lock down an Active Directory environment, but it really depends a lot on the password policies and the account permissions, and a lot of that is, once again, it comes down to properly configuring stuff, which anytime you have to rely on people to do that is like, you know what I mean? And that's what's interesting as well for like red teamers and stuff like that. It's pretty easy to do phishing attacks and stuff like that can lead to compromising an account on the Active Directory domain too. So like, yeah, a lot of interesting stuff there for sure.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to see. I know, because our company's looking into like maybe using Google Workspaces instead, because it has some of the capability that Active Directory does, but
okay,
it's kind of like we're kind of like pioneering that right now, so we don't know what all it offers yet. So
yeah, I mean, every technology is going to have its own downsides, obviously, and probably security wise as well. So there's nothing perfect too, because I mean, a lot of these things, it's like, yeah, you could make it secure if you configured things correctly, right? Like even cloud is like, AWS isn't necessarily vulnerable, right? A lot of times it's just people not using it the right way that opens them up. Yeah, just like,
their default user,
Java and PHP do not have like inherent major vulnerabilities, right? It's usually like the developers that are using it and building apps insecurely. Yeah, so that's the interesting thing, right? It's like all technology is going to have, and I mean, that's good for like everyone watching this right now that wants to be a pen tester. There'll always be like a need for it just because of that, right?
Yeah, job security for sure.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, did you have any other questions though? That was really good.
I think that's all I got for you, man.
Awesome. Yeah, well, we'll keep in touch, man, and yeah, I'll let you know once I'm about to release the networking one.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, yeah, appreciate it though.